Desert hot sunrise. Clementine Clem Monroe had spent her whole life keeping her land safe, but when Garrett Boone rode onto her property, all quiet strength and a past he wouldn't talk about, she knew she was in trouble. He crossed his arms, watching her. "You don't trust me, do you?" he murmured. "That's all right, sweetheart. I ain't asking you to. If this is fine, I can proceed." Chapter 1. A stranger rides in. The dust swirled, a miniature cyclone kicked up by the hooves of the approaching horse. Clementine Monroe squinted, her hand instinctively moving to rest on the worn leather of the rifle scabbard attached to her saddle. She sat astride Blue, her trusty roan, the midday sun beating down on the parched earth of her ranch, the Circle M. The air, thick with the scent of dry grass and distant sage, held a stillness that was both familiar and unsettling. A stillness that only a stranger could break. Clementine, or Clem as most folks called her, was a woman built for this land. At 57, her face was a roadmap of sun-weathered lines and hard-won wisdom. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was now streaked with silver, usually pulled back in a practical braid. Her eyes, the blue of a high mountain lake, held a sharpness that could cut through bullshit faster than a branding iron through butter. She'd inherited the Circle M from her father, and she'd run it single-handedly for the last 20 years, after her husband, Thomas, had succumbed to a fever that had swept through the territory like a wildfire. The rider drew closer, and Clem could make out the details. A tall man, lean and hard-muscled, sitting easily in the saddle. He wore a dusty brown duster, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, moved with a restless energy that mirrored the man's own contained power. Clem felt a prickle of unease, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. But this man, he carried an air of something dangerous, something unknown. He reined in his horse a few yards from her, the stallion snorting and pawing the ground. The man's eyes, when he finally lifted his head, were the color of dark whiskey, intense and unreadable. They held a weariness that spoke of long roads and hard battles, a weariness that resonated deep within Clem's own soul. "Afternoon," he said, his voice a low rumble, a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the wind and the dust. It was a voice that hinted at stories he wasn't ready to tell. "Afternoon," Clem replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. "You lost?" He gave a slight shake of his head.
"No, ma'am.
"I'm looking for the Circle M ranch."
This it?"
"You found it." Clem kept her gaze locked on his. "What's your business?" He dismounted, the movement fluid and graceful despite the stiffness that surely came from hours in the saddle. He stood there, tall and imposing, the sun glinting off the silver buckle of his gun belt. Clem noticed the gun, a Colt Peacemaker, worn low on his hip, the handle smooth from years of use. It wasn't a showpiece, it was a tool, an extension of the man himself. "Name's Garrett Boone," he said, extending a hand. His hand was calloused, the skin rough, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. Clem hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took his hand. His touch sent a jolt through her, a strange, unfamiliar warmth that spread through her palm and up her arm. She quickly withdrew her hand, feeling a blush creep up her neck. "Clementine Monroe. I own this ranch." "I heard," Garrett said, his gaze sweeping over the vast expanse of land, taking in the rolling hills, the distant mesas, the scattered cattle grazing peacefully under the relentless sun. "Heard you were looking for a hand." Clem frowned. She had been looking for help, but she hadn't advertised it widely. Word travels fast in these parts, but this was faster than usual. "Who told you that?" Garrett shrugged, a noncommittal movement of his broad shoulders. "A fella in Dust Devil said you were shorthanded." Dust Devil was a rough and tumble town, a haven for drifters and outlaws, the kind of place Clem avoided. The fact that he'd been there, and that he'd heard about her need for help, raised a red flag. "I am," she admitted, "but I'm particular about who I hire." He crossed his arms, watching her. The movement emphasized the breadth of his chest, the power in his arms. "You don't trust me, do you?" he murmured. "That's all right, sweetheart. I ain't asking you to." The sweetheart grated on her, but Clem ignored it. She wasn't about to be intimidated by a smooth-talking drifter, no matter how handsome he might be. And he was handsome, in a rugged, weathered sort of way. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines, with a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. There were lines etched around his eyes, lines that spoke of hardship and pain, lines that mirrored her own in a way that made her heart ache. "Trust is earned," Clem said, her voice firm. "And I don't know you from Adam."
Fair enough, Garrett said.
He looked out at the land again, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "This is good country. Reminds me of somewhere I used to know." There was a wistfulness in his voice, a hint of sadness that caught Clem's attention. She wondered about the somewhere he used to know, about the stories he carried within him. She wondered why a man like him, a man who looked like he could handle anything, was looking for work on a remote ranch. "What kind of work are you looking for?" Clem asked, breaking the silence. "Anything you got," Garrett replied. "I'm good with horses, cattle, fences, whatever needs doing. I'm not afraid of hard work." Clem studied him for a long moment, trying to gauge his honesty. She needed help. That was undeniable. The ranch was too big for her to manage alone, especially with winter coming on. But hiring a stranger, a man with a hidden past, was a risk. A risk she wasn't sure she was willing to take. "I'll think on it," Clem said finally. "Come up to the house. I'll give you something to eat, and we can talk." Garrett nodded. He mounted his horse with the same effortless grace he displayed earlier, and followed Clem as she led the way towards the ranch house, a sprawling, two-story structure built of sturdy logs and weathered stone. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. It was the place where she'd raised her children, where she'd shared her life with Thomas, where she'd buried her heart when he'd died. As they rode, Clem couldn't shake the feeling that this man, Garrett Boone, was going to change everything. She didn't know how or why, but she felt it in her bones, in the dry desert wind, in the beating of her own weary heart. The stillness had been broken, and the silence of her solitary life was about to be filled with something new, something dangerous, something tempting. She could only pray she was strong enough to withstand the storm that was surely coming. The storm he rode on. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The ranch house was quiet, filled with the ghosts of memories and the lingering scent of wood smoke and coffee. Clem led Garrett into the kitchen, a large, functional room with a worn wooden table, a cast-iron stove, and windows that looked out onto the corral. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. "Sit," Clem said, gesturing to the table. She moved around the kitchen with a familiar ease, pouring 2 mugs of coffee from a pot that always seemed to be simmering on the stove. The coffee was strong and black, the way she liked it, the way Thomas had always made it. The memory tugged at her heart, a familiar ache that she'd learned to live with. Garrett sat down at the table, his hat placed carefully on the seat beside him. He watched her as she moved, his dark eyes following her every move. He seemed to take up a lot of space, even sitting down. He radiated a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller, more confined. Clem placed a mug of coffee in front of him, along with a plate of leftover biscuits and a jar of homemade apricot jam. "It ain't much," she said, "but it'll fill your belly." "Thank you, ma'am," Garrett said, his voice softening slightly. He took a sip of the coffee, his eyes closing for a moment in appreciation. "This is good." "It'll do," Clem said, taking a seat opposite him. She watched him as he ate, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He ate with a quiet hunger, a hunger that went beyond just food. It was the hunger of a man who'd been without for too long, a man who'd known hardship and deprivation. "So," Clem said, breaking the silence, "tell me about yourself, Mr. Boone. Where are you from? What brings you to this part of the country?" Garrett hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He stared out the window, his eyes focused on the distant horizon. "I've been moving around," he said finally, his voice low and guarded. "Been a while since I stayed in one place for long." "Running from something?" Clem asked bluntly. He looked back at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It might have been anger, or it might have been pain.
Maybe, he said.
Or maybe I'm just running to something. And what might that be? He shrugged.
A new start.
A place to belong. Clem understood that longing. She'd felt it herself after Thomas died. The feeling of being adrift, of not belonging anywhere. The feeling of being alone in a vast, unforgiving world. This ain't exactly a place for belonging, Clem said, her voice tinged with bitterness. It's a hard land. It takes everything you've got and gives little back. I know hard, Garrett said, his voice firm. I've seen hard. And I'm not afraid of it. Clem believed him. She could see the hardness in his eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the way he held himself. He was a man who'd been forged in the fires of adversity, a man who'd learned to survive. What about your family? Clem asked, pushing him further. You got people somewhere? A shadow crossed Garrett's face, a fleeting expression of pain that he quickly masked. No, he said, his voice flat. No family. Clem sensed a lie, a hidden truth buried deep beneath his guarded exterior. She didn't press him, though. She knew that secrets were a common currency in this land, that everyone carried their own burdens, their own hidden wounds. I had a husband, Clem said, surprising herself with a sudden confession. Thomas. He died 20 years ago. Fever. Garrett's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of empathy, a shared understanding of loss. I'm sorry, he said, his voice sincere. It was a long time ago, Clem said, but the words felt hollow, even to her own ears. The grief never truly went away. It just faded, like an old photograph, becoming a part of the landscape of her heart. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. The clock had been a wedding gift from Thomas's parents, a reminder of a time when life had seemed simpler, more hopeful. I'll give you a week, Clem said finally, breaking the silence. A week to prove yourself. If you're as good as you say you are, I'll hire you on. But I expect honesty, and I expect hard work. And I don't tolerate trouble. Garrett nodded. You won't get any trouble from me, ma'am. I promise you that. Clem hoped he was telling the truth. She needed help, but she couldn't afford to bring trouble onto her ranch. She'd fought too hard to keep it, to protect it, to let a stranger jeopardize everything she'd worked for. You can bunk in the old line shack, Clem said. It's not much, but it's got a roof and a bed. I'll show you where it is. She stood up, and Garrett followed her, retrieving his hat from the chair. As they walked out of the house and into the fading light of the evening, Clem felt a strange mix of apprehension and anticipation. She'd taken a gamble, hiring this man, this stranger with a hidden past. But something about him, something in his eyes, in his voice, in the way he carried himself, told her that he was more than just a drifter. He was a man looking for redemption, a man looking for a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, she was too. The question burning on the tip of her tongue, yet unasked, was whether he would find it here, on her ranch, with her. Or if his past would finally catch up to him, dragging them both down into the dust. Chapter 3. The Weight of the Land. The line shack was small and rustic, built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud. It had a single room, with a narrow cot, a rickety table, and a small, pot-bellied stove in the corner. A single window, covered with oiled paper, offered a view of the vast, starlit sky. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and dry, a haven from the elements. It ain't the Ritz, Clem said, as she showed Garrett around, but it'll keep you warm. It's more than enough, Garrett replied, his gaze taking in the simple surroundings. He placed his saddlebags on the floor, his few possessions a testament to his transient life. Clem watched him, her arms crossed over her chest. She noticed the way he moved, with a quiet efficiency, a familiarity with hardship. He wasn't a man who complained or who expected comfort. He was a man who adapted, who survived. There's water in the bucket outside, Clem said, pointing to a wooden bucket near the door. And the privy's out back. Supper's at 6. Don't be late. I won't, Garrett said. He turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light of the shack. Thank you, Mrs. Monroe, for giving me a chance. Don't thank me yet, Clem said, her voice gruff. You haven't earned it. She turned to leave, but Garrett's voice stopped her. Clem, he said, using her given name for the first time. She turned back, her eyebrows raised in surprise. Why are you doing this? He asked. Why are you giving a stranger a chance? Clem hesitated. She wasn't sure she could explain it, even to herself. It wasn't just that she needed help. It was something more. Something about the way he looked at her, the way he listened, the way he seemed to understand the weight of the land, the weight of her loneliness. I see something in you, Garrett, she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Something that tells me you're not just running away. Something that tells me you're looking for something real. He held her gaze for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. And what if I am? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Then maybe you've found it, Clem said, her heart beating faster than it had in years. She turned and walked out of the shack, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the vast, silent night. The next morning, Clem woke before dawn, as she always did. She dressed in her usual work clothes, worn denim pants, a sturdy cotton shirt, and her well-worn boots. She made coffee and a simple breakfast of bacon and eggs, her mind already on the day's work. She found Garrett already up, saddling his black stallion in the corral. He moved with a quiet confidence, his hands gentle but firm on the horse's reins. He looked like he belonged there in the early morning light, surrounded by the animals and the land. Morning, Clem said, approaching him. Morning, Clem, he replied, a hint of a smile on his lips. The smile transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. We'll start with mending fences, Clem said, getting down to business. The south pasture's been needing work for weeks. They rode together, side by side, the silence between them comfortable and easy. Clem found herself watching him, admiring his skill with the horse, his natural grace in the saddle. He rode like he'd been born on horseback, like he was a part of the animal, a part of the land. They worked hard all day, replacing broken posts, stretching wire, their movements synchronized, their efforts complementing each other. Garrett was strong and tireless, his muscles rippling beneath his shirt as he worked. He didn't complain, even when the sun beat down mercilessly, or when the wire snagged and cut his hands. Clem found herself enjoying his company, enjoying the shared labor, the feeling of working alongside someone who understood the demands of the land. It had been a long time since she'd felt this sense of camaraderie, this sense of shared purpose. As they rode back to their ranch house in the late afternoon, the sky ablaze with the colors of sunset, Clem felt a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in years. She'd made the right decision, hiring Garrett. He was a good worker, a strong man, and a surprisingly gentle soul. But as they approached the house, Clem saw a sight that made her blood run cold. A group of riders, 5 of them, were gathered in front of the house. They were rough-looking men, heavily armed, their faces grim and hostile. Clem recognized them instantly. They were members of the Blackwood Gang, a notorious band of outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory for months. And standing in front of them, his hands tied behind his back, his face bruised and bloodied, was old Jed, her foreman, the only other hand she had left. Clem's heart clenched with fear and rage. She knew what this meant. They were here for her ranch, for everything she'd worked so hard to protect. And Garrett, what would they do to him? He was a stranger, an outsider. They wouldn't hesitate to kill him. The weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future crashed down on her like the weight of the whole, unforgiving sky. Chapter 4. Unspoken Promises. Clem reined in blue sharply, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle in her scabbard. Garrett did the same, his eyes narrowed, his body tensed for action. He moved his horse slightly closer to hers, a silent offer of protection. Stay behind me, Clem muttered, her voice low and urgent. She knew she was outgunned, outnumbered, but she wouldn't back down. She wouldn't let these outlaws take her ranch, her home, without a fight. Like hell I will, Garrett responded, his voice equally low, equally determined. He drew his Colt peacemaker, the movement smooth and practiced. The sunlight glinted off the steel, a cold, hard promise of violence. The leader of the Blackwood gang, a burly man with a scarred face and cold, cruel eyes, rode forward. Clem recognized him as Bart Blackwood, the ruthless leader of the gang. He was a man with a reputation for brutality, a man who enjoyed inflicting pain. Well, Blackwood sneered, his gaze raking over Clem. Look what we have here. The widow Monroe, all alone and unprotected. I'm not alone, Clem said, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her insides. She nodded towards Garrett, who sat tall and unwavering on his black stallion. And I'm not unprotected. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You think this drifter can protect you from us, old woman? He's just one man. He's more of a man than any of you, Clem retorted, her eyes blazing with defiance. She knew she was goading him, but she couldn't help herself. She wouldn't cower before this scum. Blackwood's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure rage. You'll regret those words, woman, he growled. He turned his attention to Garrett.
You.
Get off that horse and drop your gun.
Now.
Garrett didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on Blackwood's, his gun steady in his hand. I don't take orders from trash like you, he said, his voice cold and hard. Blackwood's face turned purple with fury. You'll die for that, he snarled. He raised his hand, signaling his men. Before Blackwood's men could react, Garrett moved with lightning speed. He fired his Colt, the shot echoing across the open land. One of Blackwood's men, caught completely by surprise, slumped in his saddle, a bullet hole in his chest. Clem didn't hesitate. She raised her rifle and fired, hitting another of Blackwood's men. The remaining outlaws, momentarily stunned by the sudden attack, scattered for cover, firing wildly. The air filled with the roar of gunfire, the screams of horses, the shouts of men. Clem and Garrett fought side by side, their movements coordinated, their aim deadly. They were outnumbered, but they were determined, fighting with the desperation of those who had everything to lose. Clem saw Garrett take a bullet in the arm, his face contorting in pain, but he didn't go down. He kept firing, his shots finding their mark. Clem felt a surge of admiration for him, for his courage, for his unwavering loyalty. He'd only known her for a day, yet he was risking his life to protect her ranch. The fight was short and brutal. 2 more of Blackwood's men fell, leaving only Blackwood himself. He looked around at his fallen comrades, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He turned his gun on Clem, his eyes filled with hatred. Before he could fire, Garrett shot him. The bullet struck Blackwood in the chest, knocking him off his horse. He landed heavily on the ground, his body still and lifeless. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the ragged breathing of Clem and Garrett, the soft whinnies of the horses. Clem lowered her rifle, her hand shaking. She looked at Garrett, his face pale, his arm bleeding. Are you all right? She asked, her voice trembling. I'll live, he said, managing a weak smile. He winced as he tried to move his arm. It's just a scratch. Clem knew it was more than a scratch. The bullet had gone clean through, but it had missed the bone. He was lucky. She dismounted and rushed to his side, her heart pounding with relief and gratitude. She tore a strip of cloth from her shirt and began to bandage his wound, her hands gentle and efficient. You saved my life, Garrett, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I owe you everything. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. You don't owe me anything, Clem, he said. I did what anyone would have done. No, Clem said, shaking her head. Not anyone. You stayed. You fought. You risked your life for me. He reached out with his good hand and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines etched by time and hardship. I made a promise, he said, his voice low and husky. An unspoken promise. To protect you, to protect this place. Clem felt tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't allowed herself to cry in years, not since Thomas died. But now, the tears flowed freely. Tears of relief, tears of gratitude, tears of something else. Something she couldn't quite name. She leaned into his touch, her heart aching with a longing she'd thought she'd buried long ago. She looked into his eyes, and she saw something there that mirrored her own feelings. A connection, a bond, forged in the crucible of violence and shared danger. A promise of something more, something deeper, something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The unspoken promise hung between them, heavier than the silence, more binding than any spoken vow. It was a promise born not of words, but of actions, of shared danger, of a connection that defied explanation and ignited a spark in the desolate landscape of her heart. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Wind. The aftermath of the gunfight was a blur of activity. Clem, with Garrett's help despite his injury, managed to get Jed untied and into the house. The old foreman was shaken but alive, his injuries mostly superficial. Clem tended to his wounds, her hands steady despite the tremor that still ran through her. Garrett, his arm bandaged tightly, insisted on helping with the grim task of burying the dead outlaws. Clem argued with him, telling him he needed to rest, but he wouldn't listen. He was stubborn, she realized, as stubborn as she was. It was a trait they shared, a trait that had helped them both survive in this harsh land. They buried the men in a shallow grave on a windswept hill overlooking the ranch. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of dust and sage, carrying the whispers of the dead. Clem stood there, staring at the freshly turned earth, her heart heavy with sorrow and a strange sense of peace. She defended her home. She'd survived, but at a cost. "They won't be the last," Garrett said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He stood beside her, his presence a source of comfort and strength. Clem knew he was right. The Blackwood gang was just one of many threats in this lawless territory. There would always be someone trying to take what she had, someone trying to destroy her life. "I know," Clem said, her voice weary. "But I'll be ready." Garrett turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to do this alone, Clem," he said. "Let me help you." His words resonated deep within her, touching a part of her that had been closed off for years. She'd been alone for so long, carrying the burden of the ranch, the burden of her grief, all by herself. The thought of sharing that burden, of having someone to lean on, was tempting. "I don't know, Garrett," she said, her voice hesitant. "I'm not used to relying on anyone." "I understand," he said. "But I'm not asking you to rely on me. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you. As an equal." His words were simple, but they held a power that shook Clem to her core. He wasn't offering to take over, to control her, to diminish her. He was offering to share her burden, to be her partner, her equal. She looked into his eyes, and she saw a sincerity there that she couldn't deny. She saw a strength, a loyalty, a love. She wasn't sure, but it was something close to it. Something that made her heart ache with a longing she'd thought she'd forgotten. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "All right, Garrett. We'll do this together." A smile, slow and hesitant, spread across his face. It was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his features, making him look younger, less haunted. They returned to the ranch house, the silence between them filled with a new understanding, a new connection. Clem made supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, but it tasted like a feast. They ate together at the kitchen table, sharing stories, sharing laughter, sharing the quiet comfort of each other's company. After supper, Clem insisted on checking Garrett's wound. She carefully unwrapped the bandage, her fingers gentle on his skin. The wound was still bleeding slightly, but it was clean. She cleaned it again, her touch lingering longer than necessary. "You should have seen a doctor," Clem said, her voice concerned. "No doctors in Dust Devil," Garrett said, his gaze fixed on her face. "And I wouldn't trust them anyway." Clem knew he was right. Dust Devil was a lawless town, filled with rough characters and questionable medical practices. She was probably better off tending to him herself. She re-bandaged his wound, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency. She felt his gaze on her, his eyes intense and unwavering. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, a tension that had been building since the moment he'd ridden onto her ranch. "There," Clem said, her voice slightly breathless. She stepped back, breaking the physical contact, but the emotional connection remained. "Thank you, Clem," Garrett said, his voice husky. They stood there for a long moment, their eyes locked, the silence filled with unspoken desires, unspoken fears. The wind whispered outside, carrying the scent of the night, carrying the secrets of their hearts. Clem was the first to break the silence. "You should get some rest," she said, her voice unsteady. "You've had a long day." Garrett nodded, but he didn't move. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines etched by time and hardship.
"So have you," he said.
His touch sent a shiver through her, a warmth that spread through her entire body. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the feeling of his hand on her skin. It had been so long since she'd felt this kind of intimacy, this kind of connection. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. She knew he was going to kiss her, and she wanted him to. She wanted to feel his lips on hers, to taste him, to lose herself in the moment. But then, a sudden noise, the sound of a horse approaching, shattered the spell. Clem pulled away, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushed. She looked out the window and saw a lone rider approaching the ranch house.
"Who is it?"
Garrett asked, his voice alert, his hand moving towards his gun. Even injured, he didn't falter in offering protection. Clem squinted, trying to make out the rider in the dim light. Her heart sank as she recognized the familiar figure. It was Sheriff Brody, the local lawman, a man she'd never trusted, a man she suspected of being in league with the outlaws. And she had a feeling his visit wouldn't be a friendly one, not after what had happened today. Not now, as the whispers of what they'd done, and what they were starting to feel, were just beginning to take shape in the wind. Chapter 6. The Price of Trust. Sheriff Brody was a tall, imposing man with a weathered face and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a star on his chest, but Clem had always felt that it represented corruption rather than justice. He had a way of looking at people that made them feel small and insignificant, a way of talking that made them feel like they were already guilty. "Evening, Widow Monroe," Brody said, his voice dripping with false concern. He dismounted his horse, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning the area. He took in the signs of the recent gunfight that disturbed Earth, the lingering scent of gunpowder. "Heard there was some trouble here today." "There was," Clem replied, her voice tight. She stood on the porch, her arms crossed over her chest, her body language a clear signal of defiance. Garrett stood beside her, his injured arm hidden behind his back, his good hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "The Blackwood gang," Brody said, his gaze shifting to Garrett. "Nasty bunch. You two managed to take them all down, I hear." "We defended ourselves," Clem said. "They attacked us." Brody nodded slowly, his eyes narrowed. "Self-defense, huh? That's what you're claiming?" "It's the truth," Garrett said, his voice hard and unwavering. Brody's gaze lingered on Garrett, his eyes filled with suspicion. "And who are you, stranger?" "Garrett Boone," he replied. "I work for Mrs. Monroe." Brody chuckled, a humorless sound. "A hired gun? Convenient." "He's a ranch hand," Clem said, her voice sharp. "And he saved my life." Brody ignored her. He walked towards Garrett, his hand hovering near his own gun. "You got a history, Boone? A past you're running from?" Garrett didn't flinch. He met Brody's gaze, his eyes dark and unreadable. "We all got a past, Sheriff," he said. "Some of us just choose to leave it behind." Brody studied him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and something else. Something that Clem couldn't quite decipher. It was almost like recognition. "I'll be watching you, Boone," Brody said finally, his voice low and threatening. "One wrong move, and you'll be swinging from the nearest tree." He turned his attention back to Clem. "And you, Widow Monroe, you be careful who you associate with. This ain't a place for taking chances." I can take care of myself, Sheriff, Clem said, her voice cold. And I don't need your advice. Brody smiled, a cruel, condescending smile.
We'll see about that, he said.
He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Clem and Garrett standing in the gathering darkness. Clem watched him go, her heart filled with anger and unease. She knew Brody was corrupt, that he was likely involved with the outlaws in some way. He was a dangerous man, a man who wouldn't hesitate to use his power to get what he wanted. He's trouble, Clem, Garrett said, his voice low. You need to be careful. I know, Clem said, sighing. But what can I do?
He's the law.
The law ain't always justice, Garrett said, his eyes dark with a knowledge that went beyond his years. They stood there for a moment, the silence heavy with unspoken fears, unspoken anxieties. The wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of dust and danger, carrying the weight of their precarious situation. Come inside, Clem said, finally breaking the silence. Let's get that arm looked at again. They went inside, the warmth of the house a welcome contrast to the chill of the night. Clem helped Garrett remove his shirt, her fingers brushing against his skin. She felt him flinch, and she knew she was hurting him, but she had to clean the wound. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the scars that crisscrossed his back. They were old scars, faded but still visible, a testament to a life of hardship, a life of violence. She wondered about the stories behind those scars, the battles he'd fought, the pain he'd endured. What happened to you, Garrett? She asked, her voice soft, her fingers tracing the outline of one of the scars. He stiffened, his muscles tensing beneath her touch. It's nothing, he said, his voice guarded. Just the past. Clem knew he was lying, but she didn't press him. She understood the need to keep secrets, the need to protect oneself from the pain of the past. She had her own secrets, her own scars, hidden deep within her heart. She finished cleaning and rebandaging his wound, her touch lingering longer than necessary. She felt a connection to him, a bond forged in shared danger, in shared vulnerability. She felt a desire for him, a longing that she'd thought she'd buried long ago. Thank you, Clem, Garrett said, his voice husky. He reached out and gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the lines etched by time and hardship. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside faded away. There was only the two of them, the warmth of the room, the unspoken desires that simmered between them. The price of trusting him, of letting him in, was high, she knew. But the cost of remaining alone, of shutting herself off from the possibility of love, of connection, might be even higher. And in that moment, she was willing to risk it all, to gamble on the chance that this man, this stranger with a haunted past, might be the one to finally heal her wounded heart. The sheriff's threats were a distant echo, overshadowed by the immediate, undeniable pull she felt towards the man before her. Chapter 7. Beneath a starlit sky. The tension between Clem and Garrett was palpable, a thick, heavy presence in the small kitchen. Clem stepped back, breaking the physical contact, but the emotional connection remained, stronger than ever. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a warmth that spread through her entire body. I should get to bed, she stammered, her voice unsteady. She turned away, busying herself with putting away the medical supplies, her hands trembling slightly. Clem, Garrett said, his voice low and husky. He reached out and gently took her hand, stopping her. She turned back to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked into his eyes, and she saw a vulnerability there, a tenderness that she hadn't seen before. He looked younger, somehow, stripped of the hardness, the guardedness that usually masked his emotions. Don't, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Don't go. His words were a plea, a request, an invitation. Clem felt her resolve crumbling, her resistance weakening. She'd been alone for so long, fighting her battles, carrying her burdens, all by herself. The thought of sharing that load, of having someone to lean on, of having someone to love, was overwhelming. She began, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't deny the desire that coursed through her, the longing that ached in her heart. Garrett gently pulled her closer, his hand moving from her hand to her waist. He drew her in, his body warm and solid against hers. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, mirroring her own. "I know you're afraid," he said, his voice soft, his breath warm on her face. "I am too. But I can't deny this. I can't deny what I feel for you." Clem's eyes welled up with tears, tears of relief, tears of longing, tears of surrender. She'd been fighting her feelings for him, fighting the attraction, the connection, the fear. But she couldn't fight it any longer. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw, the stubble of his beard. "I feel it too, Garrett," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I feel it too." He lowered his head and kissed her, his lips gentle and tentative at first, then deepening with a passion that surprised them both. Clem responded with an eagerness that matched his own, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. The kiss was a release, a culmination of all the unspoken desires, all the unspoken fears, all the unspoken promises that had been building between them. The kiss went on, a timeless moment under the soft glow of the kitchen lamp. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of healing, of second chances. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that bound them together, heart and soul. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding, their bodies trembling. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. "Wow," Garrett said, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. Clem smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes.
"Wow," she echoed.
They stood there for a moment, simply holding each other, savoring the feeling of closeness, of intimacy. The world outside, with its dangers and uncertainties, seemed to fade away. There was only the two of them, and the love that had blossomed between them, unexpected and undeniable. Garrett led her outside, his hand firmly clasped in hers. The night was clear and cool, the sky ablaze with a million stars. The vastness of the universe, the beauty of the starlit sky, mirrored the immensity of the emotions that surged within them. They sat together on the porch swing, their bodies close, their shoulders touching. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. The silence was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding, a shared connection. Clem leaned her head on Garrett's shoulder, her body relaxing against his. She felt safe, protected, loved. She hadn't felt this way in years, not since Thomas had died. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Clem whispered, her voice barely audible. "Me neither," Garrett said, his voice equally soft. He gently stroked her hair, his fingers tracing the silver streaks that ran through it. They sat there for a long time, simply watching the stars, listening to the night sounds, basking in the glow of their newfound love. The world was still a dangerous place, the future was still uncertain, but for now, in this moment, beneath the vast, starlit sky, they were together. And that was all that mattered. The whispers of the wind seemed to carry a new message, a message of hope, of love, of a future they would face together, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Chapter 8. A Storm Brewing. The following days settled into a rhythm, a comfortable routine punctuated by moments of intense connection and the ever-present undercurrent of danger. Clem and Garrett worked side by side, tending to the ranch, their movements synchronized, their efforts complementing each other. They shared meals, shared laughter, shared the quiet intimacy of a couple falling in love. Garrett's arm was healing well, thanks to Clem's diligent care. He was still careful with it, but he didn't let it slow him down. He was determined to prove himself, to earn his place on the ranch, to earn Clem's trust. Clem found herself relying on him more and more, not just for physical labor, but for emotional support as well. He was a good listener, a calming presence, a source of strength in a world that often felt overwhelming. She was opening up to him, sharing her fears, her hopes, her dreams, something she hadn't done with anyone since Thomas. But the peace they'd found was fragile, threatened by the shadows of the past and the uncertainties of the future. Sheriff Brody's visit had left a lingering unease, a reminder that they were not safe, that their happiness could be snatched away at any moment. One afternoon, while they were mending fences in the south pasture, Clem noticed a group of riders approaching in the distance. Her heart clenched with fear, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle she always carried. "Garrett," she said, her voice urgent.
"Look."
Garrett followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the riders instantly. It was the remnants of the Blackwood gang, reinforced with new recruits, their faces grim and determined. They were back, and they were looking for revenge. "Damn," Garrett muttered, his hand moving to his Colt. "They're not giving up." "We have to get back to the house," Clem said, her voice trembling slightly. "We'll be safer there." They mounted their horses and raced back towards the ranch house, the thunder of hooves echoing across the open land. They knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, but they wouldn't surrender. They would fight for their home, for their lives, for their love. As they approached the house, they saw that Jed, the old foreman, was already preparing for a fight. He had barricaded the windows and doors, and he was armed with a rifle and a shotgun. He was a loyal man, a brave man, and Clem was grateful for his presence. "They're coming, Clem," Jed said, his voice grim. "And there's a lot of them." "We'll be ready," Clem said, her voice firm despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. They positioned themselves inside the house, taking cover behind furniture, behind walls, their weapons ready. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their own breathing, the creaking of the house, the distant rumble of approaching horses. The storm broke with the sudden fury of a desert thunderstorm. Gunfire erupted, shattering windows, splintering wood, filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The outlaws attacked with a ferocity born of desperation and revenge, their bullets ripping through the walls of the house. Clem, Garrett, and Jed fought back with equal determination, their shots finding their marks. They were outnumbered, but they were fighting for something more than just survival. They were fighting for their home, for their love, for their future. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity. The house was riddled with bullets, the air thick with smoke and dust. Clem saw Garrett take another bullet, this time in the shoulder, his face contorting in pain. "Garrett!" she screamed, her heart filled with terror. He staggered, but he didn't fall. He kept firing, his aim deadly despite his injuries. Clem felt a surge of admiration for him, for his courage, for his unwavering loyalty. He was a true warrior, a man who would never give up, a man who would fight to the death for what he believed in. Clem herself was grazed by a bullet, a searing pain ripping through her arm. She ignored it, her focus solely on the fight, on protecting Garrett, on protecting her home. The tide of the battle began to turn when Jed, with a well-aimed shot from his shotgun, took down the leader of the attacking outlaws. The remaining gang members, demoralized by the loss of their leader, began to retreat, their attack faltering. Clem and Garrett kept firing, driving them back, forcing them to flee. The silence that followed was even more deafening than before, broken only by the ragged breathing of the defenders, the groans of the wounded, the distant sound of retreating horses. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. The ranch house was in ruins, riddled with bullets, its windows shattered, its walls splintered. Clem and Garrett were both wounded, their bodies battered and bruised. But they were alive. They had survived. And they had won. The brewing storm had broken, and while they had weathered it, the ominous clouds of future conflicts still loomed on the horizon, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their hard-won peace. Chapter 9. Scars of the Heart. The aftermath of the second attack was even more devastating than the first. The ranch house was barely habitable, its structure compromised, its interior a chaotic mess of broken furniture and shattered glass. Clem and Garrett, both wounded and exhausted, surveyed the damage, their hearts heavy with despair. "We can't stay here," Clem said, her voice weary. "It's not safe." Garrett nodded in agreement. His shoulder was bleeding heavily, his face pale and drawn. He was in a lot of pain, but he tried to hide it, his concern focused on Clem. "We'll go to the line shack," he said. It's small, but it's intact. We can regroup there. Jed, who had miraculously escaped serious injury, helped them gather some supplies: food, water, blankets, medical supplies. They loaded the supplies onto a wagon, hitched up the horses, and slowly made their way to the line shack, the silence between them filled with unspoken anxieties, unspoken fears. The line shack, which had once seemed so small and rustic, now felt like a sanctuary, a haven from the storm. They cleaned and bandaged their wounds, their movements slow and deliberate, their bodies aching from the fight. Clem tended to Garrett's shoulder wound, her hands gentle but firm. The bullet had gone clean through, but it had damaged muscle and tissue. It would take time to heal, and he would likely have a permanent scar. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the other scars that crisscrossed his body, reminders of a past he refused to talk about. She wondered about the stories behind those scars, the battles he'd fought, the pain he'd endured. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft, her fingers tracing the outline of one of the scars on his back. He stiffened, his muscles tensing beneath her touch. "It's the past," he said, his voice guarded. "It doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to me," Clem said, her voice insistent. "I want to know you, Garrett. All of you. The good and the bad." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. He wanted to tell her, she could see it in his eyes, but he was afraid. Afraid of being judged, afraid of being rejected, afraid of reliving the pain. "It's not pretty, Clem," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "It's not a story for a lady like you." "I'm not a lady," Clem said, a wry smile touching her lips. "I'm a rancher. I've seen my share of ugliness. I can handle it." He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and began to speak. He told her about his childhood, growing up in poverty and violence, about losing his family to a gang of outlaws, about his years spent wandering the West, seeking revenge, seeking redemption. He told her about the things he'd done, the things he'd seen, the things that haunted his dreams. Clem listened without interrupting, her heart aching for the young boy he'd been, for the man he'd become. She understood his pain, his anger, his need for revenge. She'd felt it herself after Thomas died. As he spoke, he began to unburden himself, releasing the pent-up emotions, the guilt, the shame, the sorrow that he'd carried for so long. Clem held his hand, her touch a silent offering of comfort, of support, of love. When he was finished, he was exhausted, drained, but there was a lightness in his eyes, a sense of relief. He'd shared his burden, he'd opened his heart, and he'd found acceptance, not judgment. "Thank you, Clem," he said, his voice husky. "For listening. For understanding." "I love you, Garrett," Clem said, her voice filled with emotion. She'd said the words without thinking, without planning, but they were true. She loved him, with all his flaws, with all his scars, with all his pain. He looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise, then softening with a tenderness that made her heart melt. "I love you too, Clem," he said. "More than I ever thought possible." They held each other close, their bodies pressed together, their hearts beating as one. They had shared their deepest secrets, their deepest fears, their deepest wounds. And in doing so, they had forged a bond that was stronger than ever, a bond that could withstand any storm. The scars of their hearts, both visible and invisible, were still there, but they were no longer a source of shame, a source of pain. They were a reminder of what they'd overcome, a testament to their resilience, a symbol of their love. The line shack, once a temporary refuge, began to feel like a home, filled with the promise of a future they would build together, a future where healing and love could finally triumph over the pain of the past. Chapter 10. Echoes of Betrayal. The relative peace of the line shack was a temporary reprieve. Clem and Garrett knew they couldn't stay there forever. The ranch house was in ruins, their supplies were dwindling, and the threat of the outlaws and Sheriff Brody still loomed large. They spent their days planning, strategizing, trying to figure out their next move. They considered leaving, starting over somewhere else, but the thought of abandoning the Circle M, The land Clem had inherited from her father, the land she'd fought so hard to protect, was unbearable. One evening, as they sat by the fire, sharing a meager meal of dried meat and beans, Garrett brought up a possibility Clem hadn't considered. "There's an old friend of mine," he said, his voice hesitant, "living in a town called Redemption, about a 2-day ride from here. He owes me a favor. A big one. Maybe he could help us." Clem looked at him, her eyebrows raised in surprise.
Redemption?
"I've heard of it. It's a rough town, isn't it?" Garrett nodded. "It is. But my friend, Silas, he's a good man. He used to be an outlaw like me. But he's turned his life around. He's the sheriff there now." Clem was wary. Trusting another lawman, especially one with a past like Garrett's, was a risk. But she also trusted Garrett, and she knew he wouldn't suggest this unless he believed it was their best option. "What kind of favor does he owe you?" Clem asked, her voice curious. Garrett hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He stared into the fire, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. "I saved his life," he said finally, his voice low. "A long time ago, back when we were both running with a different crowd." Clem knew he was referring to his outlaw past, the past he'd shared with her, the past that still haunted him. She reached out and took his hand, her touch a silent offering of support. "Tell me about it," she said, her voice gentle. He squeezed her hand, his fingers tightening around hers. He told her about a raid gone wrong, about being ambushed by a rival gang, about Silas being shot and left for dead. He told her about how he'd risked his own life to save Silas, carrying him for miles, tending to his wounds, staying with him until he was out of danger. "He would have died if it wasn't for me," Garrett said, his voice filled with emotion. "He knows that. He's always said he'd repay me someday." Clem understood the bond between these two men, the loyalty forged in shared danger, in shared hardship. It was a bond that went deeper than friendship, a bond that was as strong as family. "We'll go," Clem said, her voice firm. "We'll go to Redemption and ask for Silas's help. It's our best chance." They left the next morning, riding their horses side by side, the silence between them filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The journey was long and arduous, the landscape harsh and unforgiving. They encountered other travelers, some friendly, some not so friendly. They kept to themselves, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, their hands never far from their weapons. As they approached Redemption, Clem could see why it had a reputation for being a rough town. It was a collection of ramshackle buildings, saloons, and gambling halls, nestled in a narrow canyon, surrounded by towering cliffs. It looked like a place where anything could happen, a place where the law was often ignored. They rode into town, their arrival drawing stares from the locals. They were strangers, outsiders, and they were immediately met with suspicion. Garrett led them to the sheriff's office, a small, unassuming building located in the center of town. He dismounted and walked inside, Clem following close behind. The office was empty, except for a young deputy sitting behind a desk, cleaning his rifle. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowed. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice unfriendly. "We're looking for Sheriff Silas," Garrett said. "I'm Garrett Boone, and this is Clementine Monroe." The deputy's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Garrett Boone?"
he said.
"I've heard of you. Wait here." He disappeared into a back room, leaving Clem and Garrett alone. They stood there, their hands clasped together, their hearts pounding with anticipation. A few minutes later, the deputy returned, followed by a tall, imposing man with a weathered face and steely gray eyes. He wore a star on his chest and a gun belt strapped to his hip. He looked like a man who'd seen his share of trouble, a man who knew how to handle himself. "Garrett?" the man said, his voice filled with surprise and something else. Something that sounded like relief. "Silas," Garrett said, a smile spreading across his face. He stepped forward and embraced the man, a genuine, heartfelt embrace between two old friends. Clem watched them, her heart filled with a cautious hope. She sensed that this man, this Silas, was different from Sheriff Brody. He was a man of honor, a man of integrity, a man who would keep his word. But as Silas turned his gaze to her, a flicker of something dark and unsettling crossed his face, an echo of a betrayal that had yet to be revealed, a betrayal that could shatter the fragile foundation of trust they were desperately trying to build. Chapter 11. The Dance of Desire. Silas welcomed them warmly, his initial surprise giving way to genuine pleasure at seeing Garrett again. He ushered them into his office, offering them food and drink, his hospitality a stark contrast to the suspicion they'd encountered from the deputy. "It's good to see you, Garrett," Silas said, his voice sincere. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything, Silas," Garrett replied, his voice humble. "We were brothers once. That's all that matters." Silas nodded, his gaze shifting to Clem. He studied her for a moment, his eyes assessing, probing. The unsettling flicker Clem had seen earlier was gone, replaced by a polite, if somewhat reserved, demeanor. "This is Clementine Monroe," Garrett said, introducing her. "She owns the Circle M Ranch. We've run into some trouble." Silas listened intently as Garrett explained their situation: the attacks by the Blackwood gang, Sheriff Brody's corruption, the destruction of the ranch house. He asked questions, his eyes sharp and intelligent, his demeanor calm and professional. "I can help," Silas said finally, his voice firm. "I can offer you protection, shelter, and whatever resources you need to rebuild. And I can deal with Brody. He's been a thorn in my side for too long." Clem felt a surge of relief, of gratitude. Silas was a man of his word, a man they could trust. He was their lifeline, their hope for a future. "Thank you, Silas," Clem said, her voice choked with emotion. "We don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Silas said. "Garrett saved my life. That's a debt that can never be repaid. Consider this a small token of my gratitude." He arranged for them to stay in a small, comfortable cabin on the outskirts of town. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and safe, a haven from the dangers that lurked outside. As they settled into their new surroundings, Clem and Garrett found themselves drawn closer than ever. The shared danger, the shared loss, the shared hope for a future had forged a bond between them that was unbreakable. One evening, after a simple meal of stew and bread, they found themselves sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors. The air was cool and crisp, the silence comfortable and easy. "It's beautiful here," Clem said, her voice soft. "Peaceful." "It is," Garrett agreed. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. He gently squeezed her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her entire body. They sat there for a moment, simply holding hands, savoring the closeness, the intimacy. The unspoken desires that had been simmering between them for weeks were now bubbling to the surface, undeniable and irresistible. Garrett turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. He cupped her face in his hands, his fingers tracing the lines of her jaw, the curve of her cheek. "Clem," he said, his voice husky. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Clem knew what he was going to say. She felt the same way. She loved him, with all her heart, with all her soul. She leaned in and kissed him, her lips meeting his in a passionate embrace. The kiss was a culmination of all the unspoken emotions, all the unspoken desires, all the unspoken promises that had been building between them. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. They clung to each other, their bodies pressing together, their hearts beating as one. Garrett gently lifted her into his arms and carried her inside the cabin, his eyes never leaving hers. He laid her down on the bed, his gaze filled with love and desire. They undressed each other slowly, their hands trembling with anticipation. They explored each other's bodies, their touches gentle and reverent, their kisses filled with a passion that had been building for weeks. They made love under the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. It was a slow, tender, passionate lovemaking, a celebration of their connection, their bond, their love. It was a healing, a release, a promise of a future together. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies intertwined, their hearts content. They were safe, they were loved, they were together. I love you, Clem, Garrett whispered, his voice husky with emotion. I love you too, Clem replied, her voice equally soft. They drifted off to sleep, their dreams filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a new beginning. But even in their newfound bliss, a subtle unease lingered, a feeling that their dance of desire was being played out against a backdrop of hidden dangers, of secrets yet to be revealed. The town of Redemption might offer sanctuary, but it also held its own shadows, its own mysteries, its own potential for betrayal. Chapter 12. A desperate gamble. Life in Redemption settled into a new routine, a semblance of normalcy that was both comforting and unsettling. Clem and Garrett worked with Silas to rebuild the Circle M, sending supplies and men to the ranch, slowly but surely restoring it to its former glory. Silas proved to be a true ally, providing them with protection, resources, and a sense of security they hadn't felt in weeks. He was a man of his word, a man of integrity, and Clem found herself trusting him completely, despite the initial flicker of unease she'd felt. But the threat of Sheriff Brody still hung over them, a dark cloud on the horizon. Silas had sent word to the territorial marshal, requesting Brody's removal from office, but the wheels of justice turned slowly, and there was no guarantee that Brody would be brought to justice. One evening, as Clem and Garrett were walking back to their cabin after a long day of work, they were ambushed. A group of men, masked and armed, jumped out of the shadows, their guns trained on them. Don't move, one of the men growled. We're taking you to Brody. Clem's heart sank. She knew this was Brody's doing, his attempt to silence them, to eliminate the threat they posed to his corrupt reign. Garrett reacted instantly, pushing Clem behind him, his hand moving towards his Colt. But before he could draw his weapon, one of the men struck him on the head with the butt of his rifle. Garrett crumpled to the ground, unconscious.
Garrett!
Clem screamed, her voice filled with terror. The men grabbed her roughly, tying her hands behind her back, gagging her mouth. They dragged her away, ignoring her struggles, her pleas. They took her to a remote cabin, deep in the woods outside of town. Brody was waiting for her, his face a mask of cruel satisfaction. Well, he sneered. Look who we have here. The widow Monroe. All alone and unprotected. Clem glared at him, her eyes filled with hatred. She tried to speak, but the gag prevented her. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? Brody said, his voice dripping with venom. You thought you could bring me down. But you were wrong. I always win. He paced back and forth, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. He was clearly unhinged, driven by a lust for power, a need for control. I'm going to make an example of you, Widow Monroe, he said. I'm going to show everyone what happens to those who cross me. He signaled to his men, and they began to tie Clem to a chair, their movements rough and brutal. Clem struggled against them, her heart pounding with fear, her mind racing. She had to escape. She had to find a way to save Garrett, to save herself. As Brody watched his men prepare to torture her for information, a plan began to form in Clem's mind. It was a desperate gamble, a long shot, but it was the only chance she had. Wait, Clem managed to mumble around the gag, the sound muffled but audible. Brody stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyebrows raised in surprise.
What?
He growled. Clem struggled to speak, her words distorted by the gag. Deal make deal, Brody chuckled, a humorless sound.
A deal?
You think you have anything to offer me, old woman? Clem nodded, her eyes fixed on his. She had to convince him. She had to play on his greed, his arrogance. Gold, Circle M. Gold. Brody's eyes narrowed, a flicker of interest crossing his face. Gold? What gold? Clem knew she had him. She'd tapped into his weakness, his lust for wealth. She'd planted a seed of doubt, a seed of greed. Hidden Thomas, hidden gold, she mumbled, her voice strained. Brody stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with avarice. Tell me more, he said, his voice low and menacing. Clem took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had to be convincing. She had to make him believe her. She began to spin a tale, a fabrication of hidden gold on the Circle M, a secret stash that Thomas had hidden years ago, a secret that only she knew. She described a hidden cave, a secret map, a complex series of clues. She played on Brody's greed, his arrogance, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else. Brody listened intently, his eyes fixed on her face, his mind consumed by the thought of riches. He was hooked. He was falling for her trap. The gamble was working. But it was a dangerous game, a game with high stakes. If Brody discovered her deception, he would kill her without hesitation. But if she could keep him distracted, if she could buy herself some time, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to escape, to save Garrett, to turn the tables on this corrupt sheriff. The echoes of betrayal were all around her, but this time, she was the one weaving the web of deceit, a desperate attempt to survive in a world where trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Chapter 13. Lines in the Sand. Clem continued to weave her fabricated tale, embellishing the details, playing on Brody's greed and arrogance. She described a complex series of clues, hidden messages, and a secret map that only she could decipher. She spoke of a vast fortune, enough to make Brody the richest man in the territory. Brody listened intently, his eyes gleaming with avarice. He was completely captivated by her story, his mind consumed by the thought of gold. He had forgotten about his original plan to torture her, to make an example of her. He was now focused solely on getting his hands on the hidden treasure. "Where is this map?" Brody demanded, his voice impatient. At the ranch, Clem mumbled around the gag. Hidden in the house, Brody paced back and forth, his mind racing. He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. The thought of all that gold was too tempting to resist. "All right, Widow Monroe," he said finally. "We'll go to the ranch. You'll show me this map, and if it's real, if you're not lying to me, I might just let you live." Clem nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Her plan was working, but it was still a long shot. She had bought herself some time, but she was still a prisoner, still at Brody's mercy. Brody ordered his men to untie her, but her hands remained bound. They dragged her outside, forcing her onto a horse. They rode through the night, Brody leading the way, his men surrounding Clem, their guns trained on her. As they rode, Clem tried to think, to plan. She had to find a way to escape, to warn Garrett, to get help. But she was surrounded by enemies, outnumbered and outgunned. They arrived at the Circle M just before dawn. The ranch house was still in ruins, a testament to Brody's brutality. The sight of her destroyed home filled Clem with a renewed sense of anger, a determination to fight back. Brody forced her inside the house, his hand gripping her arm tightly. He pushed her through the debris, his eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of the hidden map. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice harsh. Clem pointed to the fireplace, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind the stones, Brody shoved her aside and began to pry loose the stones, his hands trembling with anticipation. He worked frantically, his eyes gleaming with greed. As he worked, Clem saw her chance. She spotted a loose piece of wood, a broken chair leg, lying on the floor near her feet. She subtly shifted her position, her bound hands reaching for the wood. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the wood and swung it with all her might, striking Brody on the back of the head. He let out a grunt of pain and stumbled forward, collapsing onto the floor. Clem didn't hesitate. She grabbed Brody's gun, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. She pointed the gun at Brody's men, who were staring at her in stunned disbelief. "Don't move," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Drop your weapons." The men hesitated, their eyes darting between Clem and the unconscious Brody. They were caught off guard, unsure of what to do. Before they could react, a voice rang out from the doorway. "Drop your weapons, or you're dead men." It was Garrett, his face bruised and battered, but his eyes blazing with fury. He held a rifle in his hands, his aim steady and unwavering. He was flanked by Silas and several of his deputies, their weapons also trained on Brody's men. The outlaws, realizing they were outnumbered and outgunned, slowly lowered their weapons, surrendering to the inevitable. Silas and his deputies quickly disarmed them, tying their hands behind their backs. Clem rushed to Garrett's side, her heart filled with relief and gratitude. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm fine," he said, managing a weak smile.
"Thanks to you."
He looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration and love. She had saved him. She had saved herself. She had outsmarted Brody. Silas approached them, his face grim. "Brody's alive, but he's got a nasty head wound. He'll be facing justice for his crimes." Clem looked at Brody, lying unconscious on the floor, his dreams of gold shattered. She felt a sense of satisfaction, a sense of justice. She had drawn a line in the sand, and she had defended her home, her love, her life. The echoes of betrayal still lingered, but they were fading, replaced by the promise of a new beginning, a future free from Brody's tyranny. The desperate gamble had paid off, but the cost had been high, and the scars of the battle would remain, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace and the enduring power of resilience. Chapter 14. Facing the Dawn. With Brody and his men captured, a wave of relief washed over Redemption and the surrounding territory. The reign of terror that had gripped the region for so long was finally over. Silas, true to his word, ensured that Brody and his gang faced the full force of the law. The territorial marshal arrived, and a swift trial was held, resulting in convictions and sentences that brought a sense of closure to the community. Clem and Garrett, with the help of Silas and the people of Redemption, focused on rebuilding the Circle M. The ranch house, once a symbol of destruction, was slowly but surely restored to its former glory and even improved upon. The community rallied around them, offering their labor, their resources, their support. It was a testament to the power of unity, the resilience of the human spirit. Garrett's shoulder wound healed, leaving a prominent scar, a reminder of the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made. Clem's arm also healed, her own scar mirroring his, a symbol of their shared struggle, their shared victory. As the ranch came back to life, so did Clem and Garrett's relationship. The love that had blossomed between them, forged in the crucible of danger and adversity, grew stronger with each passing day. They worked side by side, tending to the cattle, mending fences, their movements synchronized, their efforts complementing each other. They shared meals, shared laughter, shared the quiet intimacy of a couple deeply in love. One morning, as they were riding out to check on the herd, the sun just beginning to paint the sky with hues of orange and gold, Garrett reined in his horse, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Clem followed his gaze, her heart filled with a sense of peace, of contentment. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Garrett said, his voice soft. "This land, this life." "It is," Clem agreed, her voice equally soft. She looked at him, her eyes filled with love and admiration. "We did it, Garrett. We rebuilt. We survived." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "We did it together," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Nor I without you," Clem replied, her voice sincere. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines etched by time and hardship. "Clem," he said, his voice husky, "will you marry me?" The question took her by surprise, but it was a welcome surprise, a question she'd been secretly hoping he would ask. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of joy, tears of happiness. "Yes, Garrett," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will." He leaned in and kissed her, his lips gentle and tender, then deepening with a passion that reflected the depth of their love. The kiss was a promise, a commitment, a celebration of their future together. They were married a few weeks later, in a simple ceremony held on the porch of the newly rebuilt ranch house. Silas officiated the wedding, his presence a symbol of their newfound friendship, their shared bond. The people of Redemption and the surrounding ranches attended, their faces filled with joy and support. Clem wore a simple white dress, a dress she'd found in an old trunk, a dress that had belonged to her mother. It was a symbol of her past, a reminder of the generations of strong women who had come before her. Garrett wore a new suit, a gift from Silas. He looked handsome, his eyes shining with love and happiness. As they exchanged their vows, their voices firm and clear, Clem felt a sense of completeness, a sense of belonging. She had found her soulmate, her partner, her love. She had found a new beginning, a new future, a new life. After the ceremony, they celebrated with a feast, a gathering of friends and neighbors, a celebration of love and community. They danced, they laughed, they shared stories, their hearts filled with joy. As they prepared to head inside for the night, arm in arm, they see Jed approach. "Got a letter. Air for ya, Miss Clem," he says respectfully, handing over the small, dirt-stained envelope. "Came in with the supply run." Clem took the letter, the return address scrawled on the back, making her pause. It was a name she hadn't heard, hadn't even thought of in decades. A name tied to a deep, unresolved pain from her youth, a pain she thought she had long buried. A shadow from a past even Garrett didn't know. As she looks up, back at the house and the party, she knows it's just the beginning. The dawn may have broken on their new life, but the shadows of the past were long, and they were far from finished with her. Chapter 15. The Heart's Reckoning. The letter felt heavy in Clem's hand, the weight of its unseen contents pressing down on her. She excused herself from Garrett and Jed, retreating to the quiet solitude of her newly rebuilt bedroom. The sounds of celebration faded as she closed the door, replaced by the pounding of her own heart. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope, the paper brittle and aged. The handwriting was spidery and unfamiliar, but the signature at the bottom sent a jolt of recognition through her. Martha Mayfair. Martha Mayfair. The name echoed in Clem's mind, a ghost from a past she had tried so hard to forget. Martha was her younger sister by 5 years. They had been inseparable as children, sharing secrets, dreams, and the hardships of growing up on the frontier. But a bitter feud between their father and Martha's intended, a young man named Samuel from a neighboring ranch, had torn them apart. Clem's father had forbidden the marriage, viewing Samuel as unworthy and beneath their family. Martha, headstrong and deeply in love, had defied him, running away with Samuel in the dead of night. Clem had been caught in the middle, torn between her loyalty to her father and her love for her sister. She had chosen her father, a decision that had haunted her ever since. She hadn't heard from Martha in over 30 years. She had assumed her sister was lost to her forever, swallowed up by the vastness of the West. But now, this letter, it was a sign of reckoning. With a deep breath, Clem began to read. The words were filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow, of regret and forgiveness. Martha wrote of her life with Samuel, of the children they had raised, of the hardships they had endured. She wrote of Samuel's recent passing, of her loneliness, of her desire to reconnect with her only remaining family. Tears streamed down Clem's face as she read, tears of grief for the lost years, tears of relief that her sister was still alive, tears of guilt for the role she had played in their separation. Martha wrote of her intention to visit the Circle M, to see Clem again, to heal the wounds of the past. She wrote of her hope for reconciliation, for forgiveness, for a new beginning. Clem finished the letter, her heart aching with a mixture of emotions. She was overwhelmed with joy at the prospect of seeing Martha again, of reuniting with her sister. But she was also filled with trepidation, with fear. How would Martha react to her? Would she forgive her for choosing their father over her? Would they be able to bridge the chasm of 30 years, of unspoken words, of unresolved pain? She knew she had to tell Garrett. He deserved to know about her past, about her sister, about the secret she had kept hidden for so long. She found him outside, on the porch, watching the last of the guests depart. He turned to her, his eyes filled with love and concern. "Clem, what is it? You look pale." She handed him the letter, her hand trembling. "It's from my sister," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Martha. She's coming here." Garrett took the letter and read it, his expression changing from concern to surprise to understanding. He knew about Clem's difficult relationship with her father, about the burden of guilt she had carried for years. He finished reading and looked at her, his eyes filled with compassion. "This is wonderful, Clem," he said. "You'll finally be reunited with your sister." "But what if she hates me?" Clem whispered, her voice filled with fear. "What if she can't forgive me?" Garrett gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks. "She wouldn't be coming here if she hated you," he said. "She wants to reconcile, Clem. She wants to heal." His words gave her strength, gave her hope. He was right. Martha wouldn't be making this journey if she wasn't willing to forgive, to move on. "I'm scared, Garrett," Clem admitted, her voice trembling. "I know," he said. "But you're not alone. I'm here for you. We'll face this together, just like we've faced everything else." His words, his presence, his love, gave her the courage she needed. She would face her past. She would face her sister. She would face the reckoning of her heart. And with Garrett by her side, she knew she could handle anything. The echoes of betrayal might still linger, but they were fading, replaced by the hope of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of a new beginning with the sister she had thought lost forever. The letter was a bridge, a path towards healing, a chance to finally mend the broken pieces of her heart. Chapter 16. Crossroads of Fate. The days leading up to Martha's arrival were filled with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Clem busied herself with preparations, cleaning the guest room, stocking the pantry, trying to keep her mind occupied. But her thoughts kept returning to her sister, to the memories of their childhood, to the pain of their separation. Garrett was her rock, her constant support, her calming presence. He listened patiently as she shared her fears, her hopes, her regrets. He reassured her, encouraged her, reminded her of her strength, her resilience. "She's your sister, Clem," he said. "She loves you. She wouldn't be coming here if she didn't." His words gave her comfort, but they couldn't completely erase the doubt, the fear that gnawed at her insides. She had made a choice 30 years ago, a choice that had torn her family apart. She had to face the consequences of that choice, the pain she had caused. The day of Martha's arrival dawned bright and clear, the sky a vast expanse of blue. Clem stood on the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw a lone rider approaching, a woman on a chestnut mare, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun. As the rider drew closer, Clem recognized the familiar tilt of her head, the graceful way she sat in the saddle. It was Martha. Clem's breath caught in her throat, her legs trembling. She felt a surge of emotions: joy, relief, fear, guilt, love. It had been so long, so many years of silence, of separation. Martha reined in her horse a few yards from the porch, her eyes meeting Clem's. They stared at each other for a long moment, the silence filled with unspoken words, unspoken emotions. Martha was older, her face weathered and lined, her hair streaked with gray. But her eyes, those familiar blue eyes, were the same, filled with a mixture of warmth and apprehension. Clem was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Martha?" Martha smiled, a tentative smile that reached her eyes. "Clem," she said, her voice soft, a little husky. "It's good to see you." Clem rushed down the porch steps and embraced her sister, her arms wrapping around her tightly. Martha returned the embrace, her body trembling slightly. They clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces, the years of separation melting away in that single, heartfelt hug. "I've missed you so much," Clem whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I've missed you too, Clem," Martha replied, her voice equally soft. They stood there for a long moment, simply holding each other, savoring the reunion, the connection, the love that had survived the years of silence. Garrett, who had been watching from the porch, approached them slowly, his presence a silent offering of support. "Martha, this is Garrett," Clem said, introducing them. "My husband." Martha smiled at Garrett, her eyes assessing, approving. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Garrett," she said. "Thank you for taking care of my sister." "It's my honor," Garrett replied, his voice sincere. They went inside the house, the atmosphere filled with a tentative joy, a cautious hope. They sat in the living room, sharing stories, catching up on lost time. Martha told Clem about her life with Samuel, about their children, their grandchildren. She spoke of the hardships they had faced, the joys they had shared. She spoke of Samuel's love, his kindness, his unwavering devotion. Clem listened intently, her heart aching with a mixture of happiness for her sister and regret for the years they had lost. "I'm so sorry, Martha," Clem said, her voice filled with remorse. "For everything. For choosing father over you. For not supporting your marriage." Martha reached out and took Clem's hand, her touch gentle and forgiving. "It was a long time ago, Clem," she said. "We were both young, caught in a difficult situation. Father was a stubborn man. But I should have stood by you," Clem insisted, her voice filled with guilt. "You did what you thought was right at the time," Martha said. "I understand. And I forgive you." Her words were a balm to Clem's soul, a release from the burden of guilt she had carried for so long. She had been forgiven. Her sister had forgiven her. They spent the next few days getting reacquainted, rediscovering their bond, rebuilding their relationship. They talked for hours, sharing memories, sharing secrets, sharing laughter and tears. They rode together, exploring the ranch, reminiscing about their childhood. The crossroads of fate had brought them back together, mending the broken pieces of their family, healing the wounds of the past. The echoes of betrayal were finally silenced, replaced by the harmony of forgiveness, of reconciliation, of love. Clem had faced her past, she had faced her sister, and she had found redemption. And with Garrett by her side and Martha back in her life, she knew her future was brighter than ever before. It was a new chapter, a new beginning, a testament to the enduring power of family, of forgiveness, of love. Chapter 17. Shattered Illusions. Martha's visit stretched from days into weeks. The initial joy of reunion slowly gave way to a subtle undercurrent of tension. Clem noticed small things, subtle shifts in Martha's behavior that made her uneasy. Martha was overly interested in the financial details of the ranch, asking pointed questions about their income, their expenses, their assets. She seemed preoccupied with Garrett, questioning him about his past, his intentions, his feelings for Clem. She made veiled comments about Clem's age, her ability to manage the ranch, her reliance on Garrett. Clem initially dismissed these concerns, attributing them to Martha's unfamiliarity with their new life, to her natural concern for her sister. But as time went on, the unease grew, a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. One afternoon, while Clem and Martha were sorting through old family photographs in the attic, Clem stumbled upon a locked wooden box hidden beneath a pile of blankets. Curiosity piqued, she asked Martha about it. "Oh, that old thing," Martha said dismissively. "It's just some of Father's old papers. Nothing important." But Clem sensed a lie, a hesitation in Martha's voice. She insisted on opening the box, her heart pounding with a sense of foreboding. With some effort, they managed to pry open the lock. Inside, they found a collection of letters, documents, and a small, leather-bound diary. The letters were addressed to Clem's father, written in Samuel's handwriting. The diary belonged to Clem's father. As Clem began to read the letters, her blood ran cold. They were not the letters of a man unworthy and beneath their family. They were the letters of a kind, intelligent, and deeply loving man, a man who had genuinely cared for Martha. The diary entries revealed an even more shocking truth. Clem's father had fabricated the feud with Samuel's family. He had deliberately sabotaged their relationship, driven by his own prejudices, his own insecurities, his own desire to control his daughters. He had intercepted letters, spread false rumors, and manipulated both families, creating a rift where none had existed. He had done it all to keep Martha close to him, to prevent her from leaving, from finding happiness with the man she loved. Clem was devastated. Her entire understanding of her past, of her family, of her father, was shattered. The man she had idolized, the man she had chosen over her sister, was a liar, a manipulator, a cruel and selfish man. She looked at Martha, her eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I believed him. I trusted him." Martha's expression was a mixture of sorrow and something else. Something that looked like pity. "I know you didn't, Clem," she said, her voice soft. "But I did." Clem stared at her, confused.
"You knew?"
"All along?" Martha nodded. "Samuel told me. He had suspected father's interference. He had tried to warn me, but I didn't believe him. Not at first." "But why didn't you tell me?" Clem asked, her voice filled with anguish. "Why didn't you show me these letters?" Martha hesitated, her gaze shifting away from Clem's. I tried," she said. "After I ran away with Samuel, I wrote to you. I sent you copies of these letters. I begged you to see the truth." Clem was stunned. She had never received those letters. She had never known the truth. "I never got them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Father must have intercepted them." Martha nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "That's what I figured. He controlled everything, Clem. He controlled you." The realization hit Clem like a physical blow. Her father had not only destroyed Martha's relationship with Samuel, he had also destroyed Clem's relationship with her sister. He had kept them apart for 30 years, fueled by his own selfish desires. The illusion of her loving, protective father was shattered, replaced by the reality of a manipulative, controlling tyrant. And the guilt, the regret, the pain that Clem had carried for so long was now compounded by the knowledge that she had been deceived, that she had been a pawn in her father's cruel game. The shattered illusions lay around her like broken glass, reflecting the distorted image of a past she could no longer recognize, a past that had irrevocably altered the course of her life and her relationship with the sister she had finally found. Chapter 18. The Strength Within. The revelation of her father's treachery left Clem reeling. She felt betrayed, angry, and deeply, profoundly sad. The foundation of her past, the beliefs she had held for so long, had crumbled beneath her. She spent days and a days, wandering the ranch, trying to make sense of it all. She avoided Martha, unable to face her sister, unable to face the truth. Garrett was her anchor, her constant support, her unwavering source of strength. He listened patiently as she poured out her heart, her anger, her grief. He held her close, offering comfort, offering reassurance, offering love. "It's not your fault, Clem," he said repeatedly. "You were a victim of his manipulation, just like Martha." His words helped, but they couldn't completely erase the pain, the guilt, the sense of betrayal. She had made a choice based on lies, but a choice nonetheless. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, Garrett said something that finally broke through Clem's despair. "You can't change the past, Clem," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you can control the future. You can choose to let this define you, or you can choose to rise above it." His words resonated deep within her, stirring something within her soul. He was right. She couldn't undo the past, but she could learn from it. She could choose to be strong, to be resilient, to be the woman she was always meant to be. She looked at Garrett, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. He had seen her at her worst. He had seen her vulnerability, her pain, her weakness. And he still loved her. He still believed in her. "Thank you, Garrett," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "For everything." He smiled, a tender smile that reached his eyes. "I'll always be here for you, Clem," he said. "Always." The next morning, Clem sought out Martha. She found her sister sitting by the creek, her gaze fixed on the flowing water. "Martha," Clem said, her voice hesitant but firm. "We need to talk." Martha turned to her, her expression a mixture of sadness and apprehension. "I know," Martha said. "I've been avoiding you."
"I'm sorry."
Clem sat down beside her, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. "I'm angry," Clem said finally, her voice trembling. "Angry at father, angry at myself, angry at everything." Martha nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know," she said. "I felt the same way for a long time, But how did you get past it? Clem asked, her voice pleading. How did you move on? Martha looked at her, her eyes filled with a wisdom born of hardship, of resilience.
It wasn't easy, she said. It took time.
But I realized that I couldn't let Father's actions define my life. I had to choose my own path, my own happiness. But I chose him, Clem said, her voice filled with guilt. I chose him over you. You were young, Clem, Martha said. You were manipulated.
You did what you thought was right at the time.
And I forgive you. I forgave you a long time ago. Her words were a balm to Clem's soul, a release from the burden of guilt she had carried for so long. But there was still something else, something unspoken, that hung between them. Martha, Clem said, her voice hesitant. There's something different about you. Something I can't quite put my finger on. Martha's gaze shifted away from Clem's, her expression becoming guarded.
I don't know what you mean, she said.
Clem pressed on, her instincts telling her that something was amiss. You've been asking a lot of questions about the ranch, about our finances. You've been probing Garrett about his past. Martha sighed, her shoulders slumping.
I was worried about you, Clem, she said.
You're getting older. You're alone out here. I wanted to make sure you were taken care of. Clem didn't believe her. There was something else, something deeper, something Martha was hiding. Tell me the truth, Martha, Clem said, her voice firm.
Please.
Martha looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, guilt, shame, fear. And then she finally confessed. She told Clem about the debts she had incurred after Samuel's death, about the pressure she was under from creditors, about her desperate hope that Clem could help her, that the Circle M could be her salvation. The strength Clem had found within herself, the resilience she had discovered, was now being tested. She had to confront not only her father's betrayal, but also her sister's hidden agenda. The illusions were shattered, but in their place stood a newfound clarity, a determination to face the truth, no matter how painful, and to forge a future based on honesty, on integrity, on the strength of her own spirit. Chapter 19. Redemption's Embrace. Clem listened to Martha's confession, her heart sinking with each word. The joy of their reunion, the hope of reconciliation, was now tainted by the revelation of Martha's financial motives. It wasn't that Martha had asked for help, it was the deception, the undercurrent of manipulation, that wounded Clem. Why didn't you just tell me, Martha? Clem asked, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. Why all the secrecy, the probing? Martha looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. I was ashamed, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't want you to think I was just after your money. I wanted you to love me again like we used to. Clem understood the shame, the fear of rejection. She had felt it herself, after their father's death, after Thomas's death. But the deception still stung. I do love you, Martha, Clem said, her voice firm. But trust has to be earned. And you've broken that trust. Martha looked up at her, tears welling up in her eyes.
I know, she said. And I'm so sorry.
Can you ever forgive me? Clem hesitated. Forgiveness was a powerful force, a healing balm. She had received it from Martha for her past mistakes. Could she offer the same to her sister? She thought of Garrett, of his unwavering support, his belief in her strength. She thought of Silas, of his offer of help, his commitment to justice. She thought of the community of redemption, of their willingness to rally around her, to help her rebuild. She realized that forgiveness wasn't just about Martha, it was about herself. It was about letting go of the anger, the resentment, the pain. It was about choosing to move forward, to build a future based on honesty, on integrity, on love. I will forgive you, Martha, Clem said finally, her voice sincere. But it will take time. We need to rebuild that trust, brick by brick. Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Clem, she whispered.
Thank you.
Clem offered to help Martha financially, not by giving her a handout, but by offering her a loan with reasonable terms, a loan that would allow Martha to get back on her feet and rebuild her life. Martha gratefully accepted, promising to repay the loan as soon as she could. It was a business arrangement, but it was also a symbol of their renewed relationship, a foundation of trust built on honesty and mutual respect. With the truth revealed and a plan in place to move forward, a sense of peace settled over the Circle M. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they were fading, replaced by the light of hope, of forgiveness, of a new beginning. Garrett, who had been observing the exchange between Clem and Martha, approached them, his presence a source of comfort and strength. He put his arms around both of them, a silent offering of support, of unity. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice firm. Together. Martha stayed on at the Circle M, not as a guest, but as a partner. She worked alongside Clem and Garrett, tending to the cattle, mending fences, contributing to the ranch's success. She slowly but surely began to repay her debt, both financial and emotional. The relationship between Clem and Martha was no longer the idealized sisterhood of their childhood. It was something more real, more complex, more resilient. It was a relationship forged in hardship, in forgiveness, in the shared understanding of life's challenges. As the years passed, the Circle M prospered, a testament to Clem's strength, Garrett's loyalty, and Martha's redemption. The echoes of betrayal had finally faded, replaced by the harmony of a family reunited, a family healed, a family bound together by love, by forgiveness, by the enduring power of the human spirit. Redemption had embraced them all, offering a second chance, a new beginning, a future filled with hope and promise. The shattered illusions were gone, replaced by a reality that was stronger, more resilient, more beautiful than anything they could have imagined. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Years drifted by like tumbleweeds across the plains, each one marking a deeper healing, a stronger bond between Clem, Garrett, and Martha. The Circle M thrived, a testament to their collective resilience and hard work. Martha had repaid her debt, both financial and emotional, and had become an integral part of the ranch, her skills complementing Clem's and Garrett's. The peace they had found, however, was not to be undisturbed. One crisp autumn morning, a lone rider approached the ranch, his silhouette familiar and unsettling against the rising sun. It was Sheriff Brody. He was a changed man, gaunt and weathered, his eyes lacking the cruel glint they once held. He had served his time, a long sentence that had stripped him of his power, his arrogance, his very identity. He was a ghost of his former self, a shadow of the man who had once terrorized the territory. Clem, Garrett, and Martha stood on the porch, watching him approach, their bodies tense, their hands instinctively moving towards the weapons they always carried. They had not forgotten his brutality, his corruption, the pain he had inflicted upon them. Brody reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, his gaze fixed on Clem. He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff and uncertain. He looked defeated. "Clementine," he said, his voice hoarse and raspy. His use of her full name, rather than Widow Monroe, was a subtle but significant shift. "Brody," Clem replied, her voice firm but not hostile. "What do you want?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting between Clem, Garrett, and Martha. I came to apologize," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The words were unexpected, shocking. Clem, Garrett, and Martha exchanged glances, their faces filled with disbelief. "Apologize?" Clem said, her voice incredulous. "After everything you did? After the pain you caused?" Brody nodded, his head hanging low. "I know it's not enough," he said. "But I had to try. I had to make amends." He told them about his time in prison, about the reflection he had done, about the realization of the wrong he had committed. He spoke of remorse, of regret, of a desire to atone for his past. "I lost everything," he said. "My power, my position, my pride. And I deserved to lose it all. I was a cruel, corrupt man. I abused my authority. I hurt innocent people." He looked at Clem, his eyes filled with a genuine sadness, a genuine remorse. "I'm especially sorry for what I did to you, Clementine," he said. "And to your husband and your sister." Clem studied him, her heart searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the old Brody. But she saw none. She saw only a broken man, a man who had faced the consequences of his actions, a man who was seeking redemption. It was difficult, almost impossible, to reconcile this image with the man who had terrorized them, who had tried to destroy their lives. But Clem had learned the power of forgiveness, the healing balm of reconciliation. She had forgiven Martha. She had forgiven her father, in a way. Could she forgive Brody? She looked at Garrett, her eyes seeking his guidance, his support. He nodded slightly, his expression unreadable, but his hand resting on her arm, a silent offering of strength. She looked at Martha, who was staring at Brody with a mixture of anger and pity. Martha had suffered greatly because of Brody's actions, but she too had learned the power of forgiveness. Clem took a deep breath and made her decision. "I believe you, Brody," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I believe you're truly sorry. And I forgive you." The words were difficult to say, but they were also liberating. They released a burden she had carried for years, a burden of anger, of resentment, of hatred. Brody looked at her, his eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you, Clementine," he whispered. "Thank you." He didn't ask for anything, he didn't expect anything. He simply wanted to express his remorse, to seek forgiveness. He had come to the Circle M, the scene of his greatest crimes, to face his victims, to confront his past. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He was a broken man, a man seeking redemption, a man who had finally found a measure of peace. As he rode away, Clem, Garrett, and Martha watched him go, their hearts filled with a mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. The final confrontation had not been a battle of guns, but a battle of hearts. And in the end, forgiveness had triumphed, healing the wounds of the past, paving the way for a future free from the shadows of hatred and revenge. The horizon stretched before them, vast and open, filled with the promise of peace, of healing, of a love that had endured the trials of time and the storms of life. Epilogue. The years that followed were kind to the Circle M. The ranch prospered, becoming a symbol of resilience, of forgiveness, of the enduring power of the human spirit. Clem and Garrett, their love deepened by the trials they had overcome, continued to run the ranch with a quiet strength, a shared commitment to the land and to each other. Martha remained an integral part of the ranch, her skills and her companionship invaluable. The bond between the sisters, once fractured by betrayal and deceit, had healed completely, becoming stronger than ever before. They had learned to forgive, to trust, to love each other unconditionally. The story of the Circle M, of Clem's journey from solitary rancher to loving wife and reunited sister, became a local legend, a tale whispered around campfires, a testament to the enduring strength of women, the power of forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. One warm summer evening, many years after Brody's visit, Clem and Garrett sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors. They were older now, their faces lined with the passage of time, their hair streaked with silver. But their love for each other was as strong as ever, a beacon of hope, a testament to their enduring bond. Their grandchildren played at their feet, their laughter echoing across the open land. The Circle M was no longer just a ranch, it was a home, a legacy, a testament to the enduring power of family, of love, of forgiveness. Clem leaned her head on Garrett's shoulder, her body relaxing against his. She felt a sense of peace, of contentment, of gratitude. She had lived a full life, a life filled with hardship, with loss, with pain, but also with love, with joy, with triumph. "We did it, Garrett," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "We built a good life." He smiled, a tender smile that reached his eyes. "We did it together, Clem," he said. "And it's a beautiful life." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Clem looked out at the vast expanse of the Circle M, at the rolling hills, the distant mesas, the grazing cattle. She saw the fruits of their labor, the legacy of their love, the promise of a future that stretched out before them, vast and open, filled with hope and possibility. She thought of her father, of Martha, of Brody, of all the people who had shaped her life, who had contributed to her journey. She had forgiven them all. She had learned from them all. She had grown from them all. She had faced the dawn of a new frontier. She had weathered the whispers among the dust. She had navigated blood oaths and unspoken promises. She had confronted the final confrontation of hearts and horizons, and she had emerged victorious, her spirit unbroken, her heart filled with love. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clem knew that her story, the story of the Circle M, would continue, passed down through generations, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, love could bloom, forgiveness could heal, and redemption could be found. The ranch, the family, the love they shared, it was all a testament to a life well lived, a life filled with purpose, a life that had finally found its peace under the vast, starlit sky of the West. The end.